I arrived at Thornwick Hall on a morning so gray the sky seemed to mourn something I could not yet name. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel, and I pressed my gloved hand to the cold window, watching the mansion rise before me like a monument to silence. I had been hired as a governess, though the letter that summoned me had been brief, almost curt. A child needed instruction. A duke required discretion. That was all. I had no family to leave behind, no ties to sever. My previous position had ended when the household dissolved after the mistress died, and I had spent the month since then in a cramped boarding house in London, waiting for a door to open. This was that door. I told myself it did not matter that the hinges creaked, or that the wood was dark and forbidding. A door was a door. I would step through it. The estate stretched before me as the carriage slowed, and I felt my breath catch. Thornwick was larger than I had imagined, grander and more imposing. Its stone facade rose against the mist like something out of a painting, all tall windows and ivy creeping along the walls. There were turrets at the corners, narrow and watchful, and the grounds beyond were wild, the hedges overgrown, the gardens tangled with roses that had not been tended in what must have been years. It looked like a place that had been loved once and then abandoned to its own devices. The carriage stopped, and the driver climbed down to open the door for me. He did not meet my eyes. He only handed me down, retrieved my single trunk, and left it on the steps before climbing back up and driving away without a word. I stood alone in the cold, staring up at the heavy wooden doors, and I felt the first stirrings of unease. There was no footman waiting, no welcoming face, only the wind, sharp and bitter, tugging at my skirts. I lifted the brass knocker and let it fall. The sound echoed, hollow and too loud, and I waited. The moments stretched long, and I wondered if anyone would come at all. But then the door opened and a woman appeared, tall and stern, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of displeasure. She looked me over with the kind of gaze that measures worth in an instant, and I felt myself straighten under it, lifting my chin, though my heart beat unevenly. She introduced herself as Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper. She said nothing about welcome. She only gestured for me to follow, and I did, stepping into the great hall and feeling the cold settle around me like a second skin. The doors closed behind me with a soft, final thud. The halls of Thornwick were vast and cold, lined with portraits of men and women whose eyes seemed to watch me as I passed. The air smelled of beeswax and something older, something like dust and foregone conclusions. Mrs. Dawson's shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor, and I hurried to keep pace, my own steps softer, almost apologetic. I tried to take in the details as we walked, the carved banisters, the faded tapestries, the chandeliers that hung dark and unlit above us. Everything in this place spoke of wealth, but also of neglect, of a grandeur that had outlived its purpose. She brought me to a drawing room where a fire burned low in the grate, and she told me to wait. The Duke would see me shortly. I sat on the edge of a chair, my hands folded in my lap, and I studied the room. The furniture was fine, upholstered in rich fabrics that had faded to pale shadows of their former colors. There were books on the shelves, their spines uncracked, and a vase on the mantel that held no flowers. Everything in it was beautiful and untouched, as if no one had ever laughed here or wept or lived at all. I waited for what felt like an eternity. The fire crackled softly, and I watched the flames, trying to calm the nervous flutter in my chest. I told myself I had done this before. I had stood in drawing rooms and waited to be judged by men and women who held my future in their hands. This was no different. And yet it felt different. The silence here was heavier, the air thicker. When he entered, I felt the air shift. He was tall, dressed in black, his coat perfectly tailored, his cravat stark white against his throat. His face was carved from something harder than marble, all sharp lines and shadows, and his eyes were dark, almost lightless. When they settled on me, I felt as though I had been weighed and found insubstantial. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He only stood there, regarding me with a gaze that gave nothing away. He said my name as if it were a fact he had memorized and already forgotten. He told me I would be responsible for his niece, a girl of 8 named Clarissa. She was delicate, he said, and prone to sadness. I was to teach her, care for her, and above all, keep her from wandering the halls alone. There were parts of the house, he said, that were not to be entered. Certain wings, certain rooms. His voice was cold, but beneath it I heard something else, a warning, or perhaps a plea. I nodded. I told him I understood. I did not. I wanted to ask why a child should not be allowed to wander her own home, but something in his expression stopped me. He looked at me as if daring me to question him, and I found I could not. I only nodded again, and he seemed satisfied. He told me Mrs. Dawson would show me to my room, and that I was to begin my duties in the morning. Then he turned and left, and I was alone again, the weight of his presence lingering in the air like smoke. Mrs. Dawson returned and led me up a narrow staircase to the servants' wing. My room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the wild gardens. She told me supper would be brought to my room, and that I was to present myself in the nursery at 8 o'clock the following morning. Then she left, and I was alone. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the little room, and I felt the loneliness settle over me like a shroud. I had expected this, of course. A governess was neither servant nor family, and in a house like this, I would exist in the space between, belonging nowhere. But knowing it and feeling it were different things entirely. That night, I lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through cracks in the stone, and something else, something I could not quite name. A sense of waiting, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The next morning, I dressed carefully and made my way to the nursery. It was on the second floor, at the end of a long corridor lined with more portraits and more shadows. I knocked softly and entered, and I found Clarissa waiting for me by the window, a pale child with large eyes and a mouth that barely smiled. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and when I entered, she looked at me without surprise, as if she had been expecting me all along. I introduced myself gently, kneeling beside her chair, and she tilted her head, studying me the way one might study a bird that had flown into a room by accident. She did not speak at first. She only looked at me, her gaze solemn and searching, and I felt as though I were being tested in some way I did not understand. Finally, she asked me if I believed in ghosts. I paused, unsure how to answer. I told her I believed in memory, in the way the past could linger in a place. She seemed satisfied with that. She told me the house was full of memories, some of them sad, some of them angry. She said her uncle did not like to speak of them. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked her what she liked to do, hoping to turn the conversation towards something lighter. She said she liked to draw and to read, and sometimes, when no one was watching, she liked to explore. I felt a small chill at that, remembering the Duke's warning. I asked her what she meant by explore, and she only shrugged, her gaze drifting back to the window. She said there were many rooms in Thornwick, and many doors that were locked. She said she wondered what was behind them. The days that followed were quiet and strange. I taught Clarissa her lessons in the morning, arithmetic and French and history, and she was bright, quicker than I had expected. But there was a sadness in her that no amount of gentleness could quite reach. She spoke little of her parents, and when I asked, she said only that her mother had died and her father was far away. She did not say where. She did not seem to expect him back. In the afternoons, we walked the gardens when the weather allowed, though the cold was sharp and the sky remained gray. Clarissa liked to collect leaves and stones, arranging them in patterns on the nursery floor. She liked to tell me stories about the people in the portraits, making up lives for them, imagining their joys and sorrows. She had a vivid imagination, and I found myself drawn to her, despite her silence, despite her sadness. I saw the Duke rarely. He kept to his study, or rode out alone on a black horse that seemed as cold and distant as he was. When we passed in the hall, he nodded. Nothing more. I began to think of him as a shadow, something that moved through the house without ever truly inhabiting it. But I felt him everywhere. In the silence that pressed against the walls, in the way the servants spoke in hushed voices and avoided certain rooms, in the way Clarissa sometimes glanced toward the upper floors, her expression unreadable. It was on the 7th night that I heard it. A sound, faint and high, like a child crying. I woke in darkness, my heart pounding, and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound came again, muffled, distant, but unmistakable. I rose, pulled on my robe, and stepped into the hall, my hands trembling as I tied the sash. The corridor was black, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight through the tall windows. I moved slowly, following the sound, my bare feet cold against the floor. It led me to a narrow staircase I had not noticed before, tucked behind a heavy curtain at the end of the east wing. The crying grew louder as I climbed, and my breath came faster, though I could not say why I was afraid. Perhaps it was the darkness. Perhaps it was the sense that I was trespassing, that I was going somewhere I should not go. At the top of the stairs was a door, locked, but the sound came from within. I pressed my ear to the wood, and I heard it clearly now. A child, weeping softly, as if he had been weeping for a very long time and no longer expected anyone to come. My heart twisted, and I tried the handle, but it would not turn. I called out softly, asking if anyone was there. The crying stopped. Silence fell, thick and terrible. And then a small voice, trembling and uncertain, spoke through the door. He asked if I was kind. He asked if I would hurt him. My throat tightened, and I told him no. I would never hurt him. I only wanted to help. There was a pause, long and aching, and then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said his father had told him to stay hidden. He said his father was the Duke. I stood there in the darkness, my hand pressed to the door, and I did not know what to do. I did not know what to believe. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that nothing in this house was what it seemed, and I knew that I could not walk away. Not from that child. Not from that voice. Not from the secret that had just been whispered into the silence of Thornwick Hall. I did not sleep that night. I returned to my room and sat by the window, watching the moon drift across the sky, and I could not stop thinking about the child behind the locked door. His voice had been so small, so uncertain, and the words he had spoken echoed in my mind like a bell that would not stop ringing. His father was the Duke. His father had told him to stay hidden. I did not know what it meant. I did not know if I should believe him. Children sometimes told stories, invented truths to make sense of worlds they could not understand. But there had been something in his voice, something raw and honest, that made me think he was not lying. And if he was not lying, then what did that mean? That the Duke had a son he kept locked away? That there was a child in this house, hidden from the world, from me, from everyone? I thought of the Duke's face, cold and unreadable, and I wondered what kind of man would do such a thing. And I wondered what kind of woman I was, to have heard that voice and not immediately gone to Mrs. Dawson or to the Duke himself and demanded answers. But I had not. I had stood there in the darkness, pressed my hand to the door, and then I had walked away. Because I was afraid, because I did not know what to do. The morning came gray and cold, and I dressed slowly, my hands clumsy with exhaustion. I went to the nursery as usual, and Clarissa was there, sitting by the window as she always did, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when I entered, and for a moment I thought I saw something in her eyes, a question, a knowing. But then it was gone, and she smiled at me, that small, sad smile, and I wondered if I had imagined it. We went through the lessons as we always did, arithmetic and French and geography. Clarissa was attentive, her answers quick and correct, but I could not focus. My mind kept drifting back to the locked door, to the child's voice, to the silence that had followed. I found myself watching Clarissa, studying her face, wondering if she knew, if she had heard the crying too, if she had ever climbed those stairs and pressed her ear to that door. At lunchtime, Mrs. Dawson brought our tray, and I asked her, as casually as I could, about the east wing. I said I had heard a noise in the night, and I wondered if there were mice, or perhaps the wind rattling the shutters. She looked at me sharply, her eyes narrowing, and she said the east wing was not to be disturbed, that it was closed off, that there was nothing there but old furniture and memories best left alone. I nodded, and I did not press further, but I felt her gaze linger on me as she left, and I knew that she suspected something, that she knew I had gone where I should not have gone. And I wondered if she would tell the Duke. That evening, I resolved to go back. I told myself it was foolish, that I should leave well enough alone, that this was not my concern. But I could not stop thinking about the child, about the way he had asked if I was kind, about the fear in his voice. I could not walk away from that. I could not pretend I had not heard it. I waited until the house was dark and silent, and then I rose, wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, and slipped into the corridor. The moon was full that night, and the halls were bathed in pale silver light. I moved quickly, my heart pounding, and I found the curtain that hid the narrow staircase. I climbed, and when I reached the door, I stopped, pressing my hand against the wood. I called out softly, asking if he was there. For a long moment, there was no answer. And then I heard it. A small voice, hesitant and afraid, asking if it was me, the kind lady. I told him yes, it was me, and I asked him his name. He said his name was Thomas. He said he was 6 years old. He said he had been in this room for a very long time, and he did not know why. His father came to see him sometimes, he said, but not very often. And when he came, he did not stay long. He brought food and books, and sometimes he sat and read to him, but he never smiled. He never held him. He only looked at him with eyes that were sad and far away. I asked him why his father kept him here, and he said he did not know. He said his father had told him it was to keep him safe, that the world outside was dangerous, and that people would hurt him if they knew he existed. He said his father had told him he must never make a sound, never call out, never let anyone know he was there. But he had been so lonely, he said, and when he heard my footsteps on the stairs, he could not help but cry. He was sorry, he said. He hoped he had not made me angry. My throat tightened, and I told him he had done nothing wrong. I told him I was not angry. I told him I wanted to help him. I asked him if there was a key, if there was any way to open the door. But he said no. His father had the only key, and he kept it with him always. I stood there, my hand pressed to the wood, and I felt a terrible helplessness wash over me. I wanted to break the door down. I wanted to take that child in my arms and carry him out of this place. But I could not. I had no key. I had no power. I was only a governess, a woman alone in a house that did not belong to me, and I did not know what to do. I told Thomas I would come back. I told him I would find a way to help him. He asked me if I promised, and I said, yes, I promised. And then I left because I did not know what else to do, and I could not bear the sound of his voice, so small and so afraid, asking me not to leave him alone. The next day, I watched the Duke. I studied him as he passed through the halls, as he sat in his study with the door half open, as he rode out on his black horse in the early morning mist. I tried to see beyond the cold mask he wore, tried to understand what kind of man would hide his own child away. Was it shame? Was it fear? Was it something darker? Something I could not yet name? I thought of asking him directly, of confronting him and demanding the truth. But I knew I could not. I had no right. I had no proof. I had only the word of a child and the growing certainty in my own heart that something in this house was very, very wrong. I began to search. Quietly, carefully, when I knew the Duke was away and Mrs. Dawson was occupied in the kitchens. I looked through drawers and cupboards, through the papers in the study, through the books in the library. I did not know what I was looking for. A birth record, perhaps. A letter. Some proof that Thomas existed, that he was real, that he was the Duke's son. But I found nothing. Or rather, I found only absence. No mention of a child, no portrait, no record. It was as if Thomas had been erased from the world, as if he had never been born at all. One afternoon, as I was walking with Clarissa in the gardens, I asked her very gently if she had ever heard of a boy named Thomas. She looked at me with those wide, solemn eyes, and for a moment I thought she would not answer. But then she said, very quietly, that she had heard the servants whisper about a boy, a long time ago, before her mother died. She said they had spoken of him as if he were a ghost or a secret or something that should not be spoken of at all. I asked her if she knew where he was, and she shook her head. She said her uncle did not like questions, that he became very cold and very angry when people asked about things he did not want to discuss. She said it was better not to ask, better not to know. But I did want to know. I needed to know. And so I kept searching, kept listening, kept watching, and slowly, piece by piece, I began to understand. There had been a woman, years ago, before the Duke's brother died, before Clarissa came to live here. A woman who had worked in the house, a servant girl, young and beautiful and kind. The Duke had been younger then, not yet hardened by grief and duty, and he had loved her. Or perhaps it had not been love. Perhaps it had been only desire, only loneliness, only the reckless passion of a man who did not think of consequences. She had borne him a child, a son. And the scandal had been immediate and devastating. The Duke's family had been outraged. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had demanded that the woman be sent away, that the child be hidden, that the shame be buried where it could never be found. And the Duke, young and weak and desperate to appease his family, had done as he was told. He had sent the woman away. Some said she had gone to the countryside to live with distant relatives. Others said she had died, heartbroken and alone, far from the child she had been forced to leave behind. No one knew for certain. No one spoke of her. She had become a ghost, a whisper, a name that no one dared to say aloud. And the child, Thomas, he had been kept here, in this house, locked away where no one could see him. A secret, a shame, a living reminder of the Duke's greatest mistake. I learned all of this in fragments, in half-heard conversations, in the way Mrs. Dawson's mouth tightened when I mentioned the East Wing, in the way the maids looked at each other when they thought I was not watching. No one told me directly. No one would have dared. But I pieced it together, and when I did, I felt something inside me harden into resolve. I could not leave Thomas there. I could not let him spend his childhood locked in that room, alone and afraid, waiting for a father who could barely stand to look at him. It was not right. It was not just. And I would not be complicit in it. But I did not know how to free him. I did not know how to make the Duke see reason, or how to make him care. And I did not know if I had the courage to try. One evening, as I was returning to my room, I encountered the Duke in the corridor. He was standing by one of the tall windows, looking out over the darkening grounds, and he did not hear me approach. For a moment, I simply stood there, watching him, and I saw something in his face that I had not seen before, a weariness, a sorrow, a loneliness that matched the loneliness I had heard in Thomas's voice. He turned, and his eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, and then he said, very quietly, that I had been asking questions, that Mrs. Dawson had told him I had been curious about the East Wing, that I had been going places I should not go. I felt my heart begin to race, but I did not look away. I told him I had heard a child crying, that I had found a locked door, that I had spoken to a little boy who said he was his son. The Duke's face went very still, very cold, and then, without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the darkening hall, my hands trembling, my heart pounding, wondering what I had just done and what would happen next. I did not see the Duke for 2 days. He did not come to the house at mealtimes. He did not ride out in the mornings. He simply vanished, as if my words had driven him into some dark corner where even the light could not reach him. I wondered if he was angry. I wondered if he would dismiss me, send me away without a reference, leave me with nothing. But no summons came, no letter, only silence. I continued with my duties. I taught Clarissa her lessons, walked with her in the gardens, read to her in the evenings. But my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking of Thomas, alone in that locked room, waiting for someone to come. I kept thinking of the Duke's face when I had spoken to him, the way it had gone still and cold, as if I had struck him, and I kept wondering what would happen next. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Dawson came to me in the nursery. She said the Duke wished to see me in his study. Her voice was clipped, her expression disapproving, and I knew that she knew what I had done, that I had spoken of things that were not to be spoken of, that I had broken the unwritten rules of this house. I followed her down the stairs, my heart beating hard against my ribs. The study was on the ground floor, a large room lined with books and dark wood, and when I entered, the Duke was standing by the window, his back to me. He did not turn when I came in. He only stood there, looking out at the grounds, his hands clasped behind his back. Mrs. Dawson left, closing the door behind her, and I was alone with him. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive, and I waited, my hands folded in front of me, unsure of what to say or do. Finally he spoke. He said that I had put him in a difficult position, that I had discovered something I should not have discovered, that he did not know what to do with me now. I told him I was sorry if I had overstepped, but I was not sorry for caring about a child who was suffering. I was not sorry for wanting to help. He turned then, and his eyes met mine, and I saw something in them that surprised me. Not anger, not coldness, but pain, deep and raw and barely contained. He said that I did not understand, that I could not possibly understand, that the world was not as simple as I believed it to be. I told him I understood more than he thought. I said I knew about the woman, about Thomas's mother, about the scandal and the shame and the choices he had made. I said I knew he had hidden his son away to protect his family's name, to preserve his position, to avoid disgrace. But I asked him, at what cost? At the cost of a child's happiness? At the cost of his own soul? His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he would order me to leave. But he did not. Instead, he began to speak, slowly at first, and then faster, as if the words had been locked inside him for years and could no longer be contained. He told me about her, about Anne. She had been a maid in the house, he said, young and gentle and full of light. He had been 23, newly returned from university, restless and uncertain about the life that had been laid out for him. His father had been alive then, stern and unyielding, and his mother had been grooming him to marry well, to secure alliances, to fulfill his duty to the family. But he had not wanted any of it. He had wanted freedom. He had wanted something real. And Anne had been real. She had laughed easily and spoken honestly and looked at him as if he were simply a man, not a title, not a fortune, not a name to be preserved. They had fallen in love. Or perhaps it had not been love. Perhaps it had been only the illusion of love, the kind of desperate passion that burns bright and fast and leaves nothing but ash. But it had felt like love. It had felt like the only true thing in his life. When she told him she was with child, he had been terrified. He had wanted to marry her, he said, but his family would not hear of it. His mother had been furious. His father had threatened to disown him. They had told him that a duke did not marry a servant, that such a union would destroy their standing, that it would bring shame upon the entire family. He had tried to fight them. He had argued and pleaded and raged, but in the end, he had been weak. He had been young and afraid and desperate for his father's approval, and so he had given in. Anne had been sent away. He had been told she would be cared for, that she would be given money and a cottage in the countryside, that she would want for nothing. But he had never seen her again. He had written to her, he said, but his letters had been returned unopened. And then, months later, he had received word that she had died. Fever, they said. But he had never known for certain. He had never been allowed to go to her, to see her one last time, to ask her forgiveness. The child had been brought back to Thornwick. His mother had insisted. She had said the boy was family, that he could not be left to strangers, that he must be raised here. But she had also insisted that he be kept hidden, that no one must know of his existence, that the scandal must be buried forever. And so Thomas had been locked away, fed and clothed and given books and toys, but never allowed to leave that room, never allowed to be seen, never allowed to exist in the world as a real child, with a real name, with a real life. The Duke's voice broke as he spoke, and I saw the tears in his eyes, though he did not let them fall. He said he had told himself it was for the boy's protection, that the world would be cruel to him if they knew he was illegitimate, that it was better for him to be hidden than to face the scorn and rejection that would surely come. But he knew, he said, that he had been lying to himself. He had not hidden Thomas to protect him. He had hidden him to protect himself, to protect his name, to protect the life he had built on the grave of the woman he had loved and the child he had abandoned. He said he visited Thomas when he could bear it, that he brought him food and books and sat with him sometimes, though he could never find the words to say what he felt, that every time he looked at his son, he saw Anne's eyes, Anne's smile, and the guilt was so overwhelming he could barely breathe. He said he did not know how to make it right, that he had lived with this shame for 6 years, and it had hollowed him out, turned him into the cold, distant man I had seen. That he had thought, if he could just keep the secret long enough, if he could just endure, then perhaps one day it would stop hurting. But it never did. When he finished speaking, the silence in the room was profound. I stood there looking at him, and I did not know what to feel. Anger, yes. Pity, yes. But also something else. Something I had not expected. Understanding. I told him that what he had done was wrong, that he had made terrible choices, choices that had hurt an innocent child. But I also told him that it was not too late, that he could still make it right, that he could free Thomas, acknowledge him, give him the life he deserved, that it would be difficult, yes, that there would be scandal and judgment and consequences, but that the alternative, keeping him locked away, was far worse. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he asked me why I cared. Why I, a stranger, a governess with no connection to this family, would risk my position, my livelihood, to fight for a child I barely knew. I told him the truth. I told him that I had grown up without parents, that I had been raised in an orphanage where children were seen as burdens, as inconveniences, as things to be managed rather than loved. I told him that I knew what it was like to be invisible, to feel as though your existence was a mistake, to wonder if anyone in the world would care if you simply disappeared. I told him I could not bear to see another child suffer that way, that I could not walk away from Thomas, knowing he was alone, knowing he was afraid, knowing he believed he was unloved. Because I knew that feeling, and I knew how it could destroy you from the inside out. The Duke closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something in his face had changed. The coldness was still there, but beneath it, I saw something else, a flicker of resolve, a fragile, tentative hope. He said he would think about what I had said, that he could not promise anything, but that he would think. And then he dismissed me, and I left, my heart still racing, my hands still trembling, wondering if I had just changed everything or if I had only made things worse. That night, I went to see Thomas again. I told him that I had spoken to his father, that I had asked him to let him go, to give him his freedom. Thomas asked me if his father was angry, and I said no, he was not angry. He was sad, very, very sad. Thomas was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me if his father loved him. I did not know how to answer that. I did not know if the Duke was capable of love, or if the guilt and shame had taken that from him too. But I told Thomas that his father thought of him, that he visited him, that he cared, even if he did not know how to show it. Thomas said he wished he could see his father's face, that he could not remember what he looked like anymore, that sometimes he forgot if he was real or if he was just a dream. My heart broke for him, and I told him he was real, that he mattered, that he was not alone, and I promised him again that I would find a way to help him, no matter what it took. When I returned to my room that night, I found a letter waiting for me on my bed. It was sealed with the Duke's crest, and my hands shook as I opened it. Inside, in neat, precise handwriting, were only a few words. You are right. I have been a coward. Tomorrow I will begin to make amends. I read the letter 3 times, and then I pressed it to my chest, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Hope. The next morning, I woke early, my heart pounding with anticipation and fear. I did not know what the Duke meant by making amends. I did not know if he would truly free Thomas, or if his resolve would crumble in the light of day when the weight of consequence became too heavy to bear. I dressed quickly and went to the nursery, where Clarissa was already awake, sitting by the window as always. She looked at me with those knowing eyes, and she asked me if something had changed. I told her I did not know yet, but I hoped so. We had barely begun our lessons when Mrs. Dawson appeared at the door. She said the Duke wished to see me in the East Wing. My breath caught, and I looked at Clarissa, who simply nodded, as if she understood something I did not. I followed Mrs. Dawson up the stairs, through the corridors I had walked in secret, to the narrow staircase behind the curtain. But this time, the curtain was pulled back. This time, there was light streaming down from above. And when we reached the top, the door was open. The Duke stood in the center of the small room, and beside him, clinging to his leg, was a little boy. Thomas. He was smaller than I had imagined, thin and pale, with dark hair that fell into eyes that were identical to his father's. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and hope, and when I smiled at him, he buried his face in the Duke's coat. The Duke placed his hand on the boy's head, a gesture so tender it made my throat tighten. He said that he had unlocked the door that morning, that he had told Thomas he no longer had to stay hidden, that he was going to bring him downstairs into the house, into the light. I felt tears spring to my eyes, and I nodded, unable to speak. Thomas peeked out at me again, and I knelt down so that I was at his level. I told him my name. I told him I was the one who had spoken to him through the door. I told him I was so very glad to finally see his face. He asked me, in that small, uncertain voice, if I was still kind, and I told him yes, I would always be kind to him. The Duke's voice was rough when he spoke. He said that Thomas would need time to adjust, that the world beyond this room would be overwhelming for him, that he did not know how to be around other people, how to play, how to laugh. He said he had stolen that from him, and he did not know if it could be recovered. I told him that children were resilient, that Thomas was young, and with patience and love, he could learn. He could heal, but it would take time, and it would take courage, and it would take the Duke's commitment to be the father Thomas needed. The Duke looked at me, and I saw the fear in his eyes. The fear that he was not enough, that he had failed too deeply, that he could not undo the damage he had done. But I also saw determination, and that was enough. For now. We brought Thomas downstairs. Mrs. Dawson's face was a mask of shock and disapproval, but she said nothing. The servants who saw us stopped in their tracks, their eyes wide, their mouths opening in silent questions. But the Duke walked with his head high, his hand on Thomas's shoulder, and he did not falter. We brought him to the nursery, where Clarissa was waiting. She looked at Thomas with curiosity, and then she smiled. A real smile, the first I had seen from her. She said hello, and Thomas, after a long moment of hesitation, said hello back. I suggested that perhaps they could play together, and Clarissa, bless her, took Thomas's hand and led him to the corner where her toys were kept. She showed him her dolls and her picture books, and slowly, cautiously, Thomas began to touch them, to explore them, as if he could not quite believe they were real. The Duke and I stood by the door, watching, and I felt him beside me, tense and uncertain. I told him he had done the right thing, that this was the beginning of healing for both of them. He asked me what would happen now, what people would say, what society would think. I told him the truth, that there would be scandal, that people would talk, that his family would be outraged, but that none of that mattered as much as the child who was, for the first time in his life, playing with another child, discovering what it meant to be free. In the days that followed, Thomas began to emerge from his shell, slowly, tentatively, like a flower opening to the sun. He was shy and easily startled, and loud noises made him flinch. But he was also curious and bright, and he soaked up affection like a parched plant soaks up water. Clarissa became his constant companion. She was patient with him, gentle, and she seemed to understand instinctively what he needed. She taught him games and songs, and she held his hand when he was afraid. And I watched them together, and I felt something in my chest loosen, something I had not realized was so tight. The Duke visited the nursery every day. At first he simply stood by the door, watching, as if he did not know how to enter. But I encouraged him gently to sit with Thomas, to read to him, to play with him. And slowly, the distance between them began to close. One afternoon, I found them sitting together on the floor, building a tower out of wooden blocks. Thomas was laughing, a bright, clear sound that rang through the room like a bell, and the Duke was smiling. Actually smiling. It was a small smile, tentative and unsure, but it was real. And when he looked up and saw me watching, he did not look away. He simply nodded, as if to say, "Thank you." But the world outside Thornwick did not remain quiet for long. Word of Thomas's existence began to spread. The servants talked, and the servants' families talked, and soon the whispers reached the village, and then the neighboring estates, and then London itself. Letters began to arrive. Angry letters from the Duke's family, curious letters from acquaintances, judgmental letters from society matrons who delighted in scandal. The Duke read them all, his face growing harder with each one, but he did not waver. He wrote back calmly and firmly, stating that Thomas was his son, that he would not hide him any longer, and that anyone who could not accept that was no longer welcome at Thornwick. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, arrived one cold morning in a grand carriage, her face like stone. I was in the garden with the children when I saw her sweep into the house, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew what she had come for. She had come to restore order, to restore shame, to demand that Thomas be locked away again. I brought the children inside and settled them in the nursery, and then I went downstairs, drawn by a terrible curiosity and a need to know what was happening. I stood outside the drawing room, where I could hear voices raised in anger. The Dowager's voice was sharp and cold. She said the Duke had disgraced the family, that he had brought shame upon their name, that he could not possibly think he could acknowledge a bastard child and face no consequences. She demanded that Thomas be sent away, to a school, to a distant relative, anywhere but here, where his presence was a constant reminder of sin and scandal. The Duke's voice was low but firm. He said that Thomas was his son, that he would not abandon him again, that he had spent 6 years living with the guilt of what he had done, and he would not spend another day denying the child he had fathered. His mother said he was a fool, that he would lose everything, his standing, his reputation, his prospects for a suitable marriage. She said that no respectable woman would marry him now, knowing he had a bastard child living under his roof. And then the Duke said something that made my heart stop. He said he did not care about a suitable marriage. He said he had already found someone he respected, someone who had shown him what true courage looked like, someone who had fought for his son when he had been too weak to do so himself. There was a long silence, and then his mother asked, in a voice dripping with disdain, if he was speaking of the governess, if he had truly fallen so low as to develop feelings for a woman of no family, no fortune, no standing. The Duke said that I had more honor in my smallest finger than all of society had in its collective heart, and that if his mother could not see that, then perhaps she should leave. I heard the rustle of skirts, the sharp click of heels on marble, and then the door opened and the dowager swept out. She did not see me standing in the shadows, or perhaps she did, and simply did not care. She left Thornwick in a storm of fury and wounded pride, and she did not return. I stood there, my heart racing, my mind reeling. The Duke had defended me. He had spoken of me with respect, with admiration. And I did not know what to do with that knowledge, or with the feelings that were stirring inside me, feelings I had been trying so hard to ignore. That evening, the Duke came to find me. I was in the nursery, sitting with Thomas and Clarissa as they drew pictures by the fire. He asked if he could speak with me, and I nodded, following him out into the corridor. He said that he owed me an apology, that I had heard things I should not have heard, that his mother had been unkind, and he was sorry for it. I told him he had nothing to apologize for, that I understood the position I held, the limitations of my station, that I had not expected anything more than to help a child in need. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said very quietly that I had given him far more than that. I had given him the courage to face his past, to reclaim his humanity, to become the man he should have been all along. I did not know what to say. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, and I looked away, suddenly aware of how close he was standing, how his eyes seemed to see straight through me. He said that he knew it was improper, that society would condemn him for even thinking such thoughts, but that he could not help what he felt, that I had become important to him in ways he had not expected, in ways he could not ignore. I told him, my voice barely above a whisper, that I felt it too. That somewhere in the midst of fighting for Thomas, of watching him heal, of seeing the Duke become the father his son needed, something had shifted inside me. That I had begun to care for him, not as an employer, but as a man. A flawed, complicated, deeply wounded man, but a man who was trying to do better. And that was more than I had ever hoped to find. He reached out and took my hand, and I let him. We stood there in the quiet corridor, the fire from the nursery casting dancing shadows on the walls. And for the first time since I had arrived at Thornwick, I felt as though I belonged, not as a servant, not as an outsider, but as someone who mattered, someone who was seen. He said that he could not offer me what society would deem a proper courtship, that there would be scandal and judgment and consequences, but that if I was willing, if I was brave enough, he would like to try, to build something real, something honest, something that was theirs alone. I told him I had never been afraid of scandal, that I had never belonged to society's world, and so I had nothing to lose, and that if he was willing to risk everything for Thomas, then I was willing to risk everything for him. He smiled then, a real smile, full and unguarded, and he lifted my hand to his lips and kissed it gently. And in that moment, I knew that everything had changed, that the life I had imagined for myself, small and quiet and alone, was gone. And in its place was something far more terrifying and far more beautiful. A future I could not yet see, but one I was finally ready to reach for. The months that followed were not easy. There were days when I wondered if we had been foolish, if the cost of our choices would be too high to bear. Society did not forgive easily, and the scandal of the Duke's illegitimate son, combined with whispers of his growing attachment to a governess, made us the subject of endless gossip and speculation. Invitations stopped arriving. Old friends turned away when they saw us in the village. The letters continued, some cruel, some pitying, all of them a reminder that we had stepped outside the lines that governed the world we lived in. But the Duke bore it with a quiet dignity that surprised me. He had spent so many years hiding, so many years living in fear of judgment, that when it finally came, he found he no longer cared. He had his son. He had chosen truth over pretense. And he had me. Thomas flourished in ways I had not dared to hope. The pale, frightened child who had once been locked away grew stronger each day. He learned to run in the gardens, to climb trees, to laugh without fear. Clarissa remained his devoted companion, and together they brought a lightness to Thornwick that had been absent for far too long. The house, which had felt like a tomb when I first arrived, began to feel like a home. The Duke spent hours with Thomas, making up for the years he had lost. He taught him to ride, sitting beside him on the black horse that had once seemed so forbidding. He read to him every evening before bed, and I would sometimes stand in the doorway, watching them together, and feel my heart swell with something I had never expected to feel. Love. Not just for the Duke, though that had grown deeper than I could have imagined, but for the family we were becoming. The imperfect, scandalous, beautiful family that had formed in the ruins of shame and regret. But there was one thing that remained unresolved. One shadow that still hung over us. The mystery of Anne, Thomas's mother. The Duke had told me she had died, but he had never known the circumstances, had never been allowed to see her grave, had never been given the chance to say goodbye, and I could see that it haunted him, that he carried the guilt of her loss like a weight on his chest, pressing down until it was hard to breathe. One evening, as we sat together in the library after the children had gone to bed, I asked him if he had ever tried to find out what truly happened to her. He said he had not, that he had been afraid of what he might discover, afraid that his family had lied to him, that she had suffered more than he knew, that her death had been his fault in ways he could not bear to face. I told him that not knowing was worse than knowing, that the uncertainty would poison him, poison us, if he did not lay it to rest. I told him that we could search for the truth together, and that whatever we found, we would face it together. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he nodded. And so we began. It took weeks of searching. We wrote letters to parishes in the countryside, to workhouses, to hospitals. We followed every lead, no matter how faint. And finally, in a small village 2 days' journey from Thornwick, we found her. Anne was not dead. She was alive. She lived in a tiny cottage on the edge of the village, and she worked as a seamstress. She had never married. She had never had other children. She had simply existed, quietly and alone, for the past 6 years, believing that her son had been taken from her forever, that she would never see him again. When the Duke read the letter confirming her whereabouts, his hand shook. He asked me if I thought she would see him, if she would forgive him. I told him I did not know, but that he had to try. We traveled to the village, leaving the children in Mrs. Dawson's care. The journey was long and silent, the Duke lost in thoughts I could not reach. When we arrived at the cottage, he stood outside for a long time, staring at the door, and I saw the fear in his eyes. The fear of facing the woman he had loved and abandoned. The fear of her hatred, her pain, her rightful rage. I took his hand and squeezed it gently. I told him he was not the same man who had sent her away, that he had changed, that he had fought to free their son, and that she deserved to know that. He knocked, and when the door opened and Anne stood there, her eyes widening in shock and disbelief, I saw the Duke's face crumble. He said her name, just once, and she stared at him as if he were a ghost. She asked him why he had come. Her voice was cold, guarded, and I could see the years of pain written in every line of her face. He told her he had come to tell her the truth, to tell her about Thomas, to tell her that he was alive and healthy and free, and to beg her forgiveness for what he had done. She listened, her expression unreadable, as he told her everything. How Thomas had been kept hidden. How he had finally found the courage to bring him into the light. How he had spent every day since trying to make amends for the choices he had made. And when he finished, there was a long, terrible silence, and then Anne began to cry. Not the soft, delicate tears of a lady, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She said she had thought Thomas was lost to her forever, that she had been told he was being raised by a respectable family, far away, where she could never reach him, that she had tried to find him, but the Duke's family had blocked her at every turn, had threatened her, had told her that if she ever tried to contact him again, she would be arrested for disturbing the peace. She said she had wanted to die, that she had spent years wishing she could simply stop existing, because the pain of losing her child was too much to bear. But she had survived. She had endured, because somewhere, deep inside, she had hoped that one day, somehow, she might see him again. The Duke knelt before her, and he took her hands in his, and he told her he was sorry. That he had been weak and cowardly and cruel, that he had let his family control him, let his fear of scandal destroy the only real thing he had ever had. That he could never undo what he had done, but that he wanted to try to make it right. He wanted her to see Thomas, to know him, to be his mother, if she would accept that role. Anne looked at him, and I saw the war in her eyes, the desire to forgive and the inability to forget. She asked him if he truly meant it, if he would truly allow her to be part of Thomas's life, and he said yes, without hesitation. Yes. She asked to see him, immediately. And so we returned to Thornwick, and we brought Anne with us. When Thomas saw her, he did not recognize her. How could he? He had been a baby when they were separated. But when the Duke knelt beside him and told him that this was his mother, that she had loved him all along, that she had never stopped thinking of him, Thomas looked at her with those wide, solemn eyes, and he asked her if she was kind. Anne's face crumpled, and she said yes, she was kind, and she would always be kind to him, and she would never, ever leave him again. And Thomas, with the simple faith of a child, walked into her arms, and she held him as if she would never let him go. I watched them, and I felt tears stream down my face. Beside me, the Duke stood with his hand over his mouth, his shoulders shaking. And I realized that this moment, was the true beginning of healing, not just for Thomas, but for all of us. In the weeks that followed, we found a new rhythm. Anne moved into a cottage on the Thornwick estate, close enough to see Thomas every day, but with her own space, her own independence. She was wary of the Duke at first, and I could not blame her. But slowly, as she saw how he cared for Thomas, how he had changed, the walls between them began to soften. They would never be what they once were. That love had been broken beyond repair, but they found something new, a friendship, a partnership built on their shared love for their son, and that, I thought, was more than either of them had expected. As for the Duke and me, Our connection deepened in ways that felt both inevitable and miraculous. He asked me to marry him one evening in the garden, under the same stars that had witnessed so much pain and transformation. He said he knew it would cause more scandal, that people would say he was mad to marry a governess, to tie himself to a woman of no fortune or standing, but that he did not care, that I had given him back his life, his son, his soul, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his days proving to me that I had not made a mistake in believing in him. I said yes, not because I needed his title or his wealth, but because I loved him. The complicated, wounded, courageous man who had learned to fight for what mattered, who had learned to be a father, who had learned to be honest, even when honesty cost him everything. We married quietly in the small chapel on the estate, with only Thomas, Clarissa, Anne, and Mrs. Dawson in attendance. There was no grand celebration, no glittering ball, no approval from society. But as I stood beside him and felt his hand warm in mine and looked out at the people who had become my family, I knew that this was worth more than any amount of society's approval could ever be. Thomas called me Mama for the first time a month after the wedding. It was casual, unthinking, and when he realized what he had said, he looked at me with wide, worried eyes, as if afraid he had done something wrong. I knelt down and told him that I would be honored to be his mama if that was what he wanted. And he smiled, that beautiful, radiant smile, and he threw his arms around my neck. Anne did not mind. She told me she was grateful that Thomas had someone else to love him, someone else to care for him when she could not be there. She said that love did not diminish when it was shared. It only grew, and so our unconventional family grew together. Thomas thrived. A bright, curious boy who loved books and horses and climbing trees. Clarissa remained with us, and I formally adopted her after her father, the Duke's brother, failed to return from abroad. She and Thomas were inseparable, more like twins than cousins, and watching them together filled me with a joy I had never known existed. The Duke and I had a child of our own, a daughter we named Hope, because that was what we had given each other. Hope for a future we had not dared to imagine. Hope that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Hope that it was never too late to choose truth over shame, courage over fear, connection over isolation. Thornwick, once a place of silence and secrets, became a place of laughter and light. The gardens were tended again, the halls echoed with the sound of running feet and children's voices. And though society never fully forgave us, though we were never invited back into the circles we had left behind, I found I did not care. We had built something better than society's approval. We had built a home. Years later, when Thomas was grown and preparing to leave for university, he asked me why I had fought for him when I barely knew him, why I had risked everything for a child who was not mine, who had no claim on me. I told him what I had told his father all those years ago, that I knew what it was like to be invisible, to feel unloved, to believe that your existence was a burden, and that I could not bear to let another child suffer that way. But I also told him something else, something I had not fully understood back then, but that I understood now. That love is not about blood or obligation or what society deems appropriate. Love is a choice, a decision to see someone, truly see them, and to fight for them, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. And I told him that choosing him, choosing his father, choosing this messy, imperfect, beautiful family had been the best choice I had ever made. He hugged me then, this tall, strong young man who had once been a frightened little boy behind a locked door, and he whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for not walking away." And I held him close, and I thought about the journey we had all taken. The Duke, who had learned to be brave. Anne, who had learned to forgive. Thomas, who had learned to trust. And me, who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not in changing the world, but in refusing to accept that the world cannot be changed. We had all been broken in our own ways, but we had found each other in the darkness, and we had chosen to heal together. And that, I thought, was a kind of love that no scandal, no judgment, no passage of time could ever diminish. Thornwick Hall stood as it always had, stone and ivy and history, but inside its walls something new had been born. Not perfection, not a fairy tale, but something real, something earned, something worth every moment of fear and struggle it had taken to create. We had found our way home, not to a place, but to each other, and that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.